Mr. Harum, Mr. Wilson. Mr. Harum.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, members of the board, my name is
Steve.
Put
that mic up a little higher.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Members of the board, my name is Steve Harum. I represent the city of Stockton, and I appreciate this opportunity to speak to you today. Three quick overviews. Number one is that the city of Stockton has fully participated in the administrative process concerning the certification of the CIR and adoption of the plan. We continue to object to the adoption of the plan in its current form. Number two, rather than repeating all of the arguments previously made by the city in its many presentations, oral and in writing, I'm going to just focus on two deficiencies that we observe in the EIR. But by limiting that presentation, we're not abandoning or waiving our other arguments, but in the interest of time, we want to use those two for illustrative purposes. And then finally, number three, I would like to, in the abundance of caution, introduce into the record a May 7, 2013 letter consisting of 6 pages to Ms. Messer from Stephen Chase, who is the Community Development Director of the City of Stockton. The chairman mentioned a May 13 letter, which I believe is from Dr. Lytle, representing the city, but for some reason the May 7 letter was not mentioned, and I just want to make sure that that is made part of the record of these proceedings. And I will deliver a copy of it to...
Let's do that. I don't have any information, but Ms. Messer will be available, staff will be available. They'll work with you.
I will just give her a copy of it to make sure that it's part of the record. I wanted to make sure it was not omitted because it contains important expert testimony as defined by CEQA. With that, let me turn to the two issues I'd like to briefly address with you. The first one is a failure of the CIR to address secondary environmental effects of the proposed regulation. Now, on January 14, the City of Stockton provided comments to the EIR during the comment period. In part, the comments pointed out that the city has spent millions of dollars in preparing municipal infrastructure and utility plans. These plans are designed to construct public facilities in phases as demand for public services require additional capacity from those facilities. In that regard, it's no different than any other city. The infrastructure and master plans were approved and were prepared and approved by the city after the city satisfied CEQA, and the plans were generally approved before the co-equal goals were even established or talked about. So in other words, these plans were done without consideration of the co-equal goals. They may or may not be consistent with them. It wasn't a factor that needed to be looked at by local government at that moment in time. With that regard, much of all the infrastructure, at least the first phases, have been constructed according to those adopted plans, and indeed those structures are located within areas of jurisdiction of your agency. Now, according to the government code, specifically sections 65300, 65302.2, and 65401 of the government code, Stockton's general plan, development code, and spheres of influence are to be correlated to these infrastructure plans in order to achieve orderly and logical growth through an efficient and economical extension of public services. And in anticipation of that growth pattern was depicted on the general plan, and indeed the conclusion of the general plan was that this was the environmentally superior way for the community to accommodate growth pressures in the future.
Mr. Harum, can I clarify something?
Yes, sir.
Is this I think it's 2,000 acres of land that used to be in your sphere of influence but no longer is? It was withdrawn that we're talking about?
No, sir.
It's not? Okay.
No, it's talking about the current sphere of influence.
Which property are you talking about?
I'm talking about there are a number of properties which are in the sphere of influence.
All within the sphere of influence?
Well,
sorry?
I'm only talking about properties. I'm talking about the current general plan.
Yes.
And the sphere of influence.
Yes.
The boundaries of the general plan and the sphere of influence, as you well know, are not necessarily coterminous. So the sphere is actually smaller than the general plan. That's how most cities operate.
Then I interpret your comments as saying you are seeking to deal with land which is not within the city limits, not within the sphere of influence, and not under the authority of Stockton, but you hope at some time in the future it will be.
Then you are wrong-headed. That's
so
not at all.
Explain to me what we're talking
about. I am speaking of the land which is currently in the general plan, currently in the sphere of influence, and currently within the incorporated boundaries of the city. My comments do not deal with any property that is outside either the general plan or the sphere of influence.
Okay. As long as it's in the city limits today and the sphere of influence today.
Or the general plan today. That's what my statement said.
Well,
I mean,
has the general plan of Stockton, does it now, or has it ever included territory not within the city limits or the sphere of influence?
of course. That's what every general
Got it.
plan does. If you go to
Okay.
the general plan OPR
Mr. Harem,
guidelines on general plan, it will tell you that.
I understand your point.
Okay.
Does the city of Stockton have legal authority over property outside the city limits or the sphere of influence?
It depends on what you mean by legal authority. It certainly has the power. I mean,
Mr. Harem, that's not a great argument. You don't control the property. You don't have legal authority. That's what a sphere of influence is about. You
what are we
seek to
arguing?
do it.
I'm not talking about lands outside the sphere of influence.
Oh, okay, great.
Well, that's what I said.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, anyway, the city's January 14 letter points out that the current form of the Delta Plan is subject to phasing decisions for the existing municipal infrastructure for DSC review. The risk of an appeal to the DSC and the injunctive effect of the appeal makes it virtually impossible for Stockton to bid the job, keep construction bids valid during the appeal period. Plus, if any extension or phase is rejected, Stockton will probably be forced to construct parallel facilities outside the DSC's jurisdiction. In short, the regulation starts a chain of events where the location of the municipal infrastructure will change. This, in turn, will change the current anticipated pattern of urban growth, a pattern of growth that was found to be environmentally superior and that will be replaced by growth patterns which are not environmentally superior. There is sufficient legal authority, particularly from the Riverside case, that talks about regulations that change patterns of urban growth must be studied as part of the EIR. A major problem with this EIR is it omits any discussion or evaluation of that possibility, and thus constitutes a failure to proceed in a manner required by law. Since by definition this alternative pattern is not as environmentally superior, it means those impacts will probably be significant and have effects that have not been studied by any EIR at this point, but are caused by the adoption of the regulation. Now, the last time I spoke a couple months ago, the chairman expressed confusion, I apparently confused him, with respect to what is this chain of events. So let me take a moment to try to explain what that means in the context of adopting an EIR. There is a section of the CEQA guidelines, I think it's 15064E, which states that economic impacts are not to be studied in environmental impact report. It then goes on to say, however, if economic impacts turn around and cause physical impacts or environmental impacts, they are called secondary impacts and they must be studied. Let me give you two examples to put that into context. The first one is a case called Bakersfield Citizens against the City of Bakersfield, a case that I successfully handled through the appellate court, where the Walmart company proposed two large supercenters within the same market area. And they concluded that even though they might drive other stores out of business, that was not an environmental effect. The case we posited to the appellate court, which the appellate court accepted, was that by oversaturating the market and causing a decline in retail stores, that would cause the secondary effect of urban decay. Direct economic factor, which was the overconcentration of retail within the marketplace, leads to a secondary factor, which would be urban decay. Probably the better example from a regulatory standpoint is the Riverside case, which I mentioned earlier. What happened in Riverside is that the public agency proposed changes in general plan regulations, which would eliminate deference to city development standards, locations of development, and density intensity, and the levels of public service. The city of Riverside opposed that, saying, wait, you're changing the development pattern. You've got to look at that as part of this regulation. And indeed, the appellate court said that the EIR was legally deficient in as much as it did not look at how the regulations might change the pattern of urban development. And I believe these regulations and this EIR falls into the exact same problem in as much as there's no discussion in your EIR about that issue. And we're just saying you have to look at it. The whole purpose of CEQA is to understand all of the potential environmental effects of a project. You have expert testimony from the city that this is likely to happen. And that requires an EIR that meets minimum standards to evaluate and study that issue before proceeding on the project. And that we're asking that that take place. And indeed, the letters from Dr. Lytle and Mr. Chase from March 28 lay out how that exactly could happen, how the chain of events could occur so there'll be a change in the urban patterns. As a second example, the EIR does not evaluate the chain of events between the regulatory economic effects and the indirect economic effects that will harm downtown redevelopment and will lead to potential for urban decay in the city of Stockton. Again, the March 18 letters present this and indicate that the regulations will have a chilling effect on formation of capital, which in turn will lead to urban decay as you do not have either retailers coming into town, retailers improving their business, or shut down facilities. And there's no discussion of that within the EIR. But what is critical here is how the EIR treats this comment, which I think is fascinating, and that's at page 3.29 of the final EIR. To start with, the final EIR makes a wild claim that just misses the point, and it says that the chain of events starts with conversion of agricultural land. Now, how the EIR reached that conclusion mystifies me, inasmuch as the term conversion of agricultural land is never used in any of our comments. So it starts with a patently erroneous assumption. And whenever you start with a wrong assumption, it generally gets worse and not better, and this is another example of that. In the end, it says, quote, that the comment's rejected because, quote, there is not substantial evidence that these effects would occur, and if they occurred, they would not be substantial adverse physical effects that could not be mitigated, end quote. This comment is not sufficient as a matter of law for a couple of reasons. First of all, it is extremely clear that a public agency cannot blame the public for not explaining what the environmental effects are. That's what the EIR is supposed to do, and an EIR is not allowed to turn around and say, since we didn't study it, there's no evidence, and we can cut off the comment. That lesson was taught to us in the Sundstrom case, where the Sundstrom case where the appellate court wrote 25 years ago, the agency should not be allowed to hide behind its own failure to gather relevant data. CEQA places a burden on environmental investigation on government rather than the public. So the implication of the response to comment, it was the duty of the public commenting to do the EIR's work. And Sundstrom tells us, no, that gets it upside down. You can't do it that way. It goes on, the opinion goes on to say, quote, deficiencies in the record actually enlarge the scope by lending a logical plausibility of a wider range of inferences. In the absence of any further information, the record permits the reasonable inference that sludge disposal presents a material environmental impact. Same is true here. You have an EIR that omits any analysis at all. You have someone from the public commenting, providing two expert opinions that there is an impact that's going to happen, and the response in the EIR is, well, you didn't prove that it's going to be an impact. It got it upside down. But I want to conclude by pointing out to you exactly what the agency did to try to learn this. Take a look at the following statements from the agency's representation in the statements of economic impact and ask yourself, did the agency have sufficient information to decide whether the concerns of the city of Stockton were true or not? Here is what the representations in that statement say. Quote, the total cost of the Delta Plan policies to private business is unknown, and the total number and types of business impacted, including small business, is also unknown, unquote. Quote, the number of businesses and jobs created or eliminated is uncertain, end quote. Quote, the number of businesses impacted cannot be estimated, end quote. Quote, as even expressed as a range, the cost estimate to businesses and individuals is highly uncertain, end quote. Quote, neither the magnitude nor the share of such costs can be estimated by industry with any precision, end quote. My point's very simple there. An EIR is an informational document. It is supposed to provide the decision maker and the public with information so that the environmental effects of the proposal are understood. The City of Stockton, in good faith, has commented several times to you, provided you with expert testimony that there is an impact that the EIR omitted and did not study. The EIR's response was, Stockton, you didn't prove your case. First of all, that's legally erroneous. But number two, The EIR itself demonstrates it has done nothing and does not even know whether it's significant or not. That is simply a failure to proceed as a matter required by law. I would just conclude then and really echo the comments that Councilmember Miller made. We believe a lot of these problems can be corrected. And really there is a disconnect from what I can gather between the plain language of the plan and the regulations and the interpretive oral statements that are made by your staff. I absolutely believe we have an ability very quickly to fix that so that the plan is more certain, more stable, completely fulfills the objectives of the Delta Reform Act of 2009, but takes away some of the chaos and mischief the way the plan is certainly written. And we urge you to give us a chance to work with you so that we're able to do that. We're not here to defeat the plan. We're not here to take it away. We understand you have a duty to implement the statute. We want it to be done in a way that's workable, meaningful, with certainty, that's fair to all. And it's not there right now. That is what we want to do, and we respectfully ask the chance to work with you to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Harum.